Debate review: Joe Heschmeyer versus Cade. Now, before we begin, I must be completely upfront with you. There are portions of this script that the editing software that I use from Microsoft Word was unwilling to help me with. So there might be some pieces here that are grammatically incorrect. And that also means that some of this content might not be as monetizable as other videos. So, with that in mind, if you enjoy this type of content and commentary, please like and subscribe, and please share my videos. That helps this channel grow and protects me in situations like this where a video might not get the exposure that it would get otherwise. Anyway, let us begin. I want to offer a substantive yet charitable evaluation of the recent exchange between Catholic apologist Joe Heschmeyer and Cade, who operates under several monikers online, including Intrinsically Ordered and Gay Xtrad. Cade has previously appeared on my channel and engaged in a wide-ranging conversation about Catholic moral teaching, particularly as it relates to LGBTQ plus identity and natural law. Though I don't know him personally, Cade is a friend of the channel, and I respect his willingness to engage in direct and often uncomfortable dialogue with Catholic thinkers. That respect, along with my own bias toward open discourse, is something that I acknowledge at the onset. That said, my goal in this review is to fairly assess the intellectual merit and rhetorical force of the conversation, whether it was a debate, an interview gone awry, or something else entirely, and to offer some broader theological and philosophical reflections that I hope will serve my audience well. So let's begin with the obvious question. Was it an interview or an ambush? We must address the structural ambiguity of the exchange. Heschmeyer has claimed that he expected a friendly interview. I really don't know why he would expect that, but that's what he says. And that the conversation shifted into adversarial territory about 10 minutes in. Cade, on the other hand, labeled the event a debate from the start. It's unclear whether miscommunication, opportunism, or simply evolving dynamics led to the shift in tone. What is clear is that both parties quickly found themselves in a dialectical space where they had to defend moral claims under pressure. From a rhetorical and academic standpoint, this matters. If one participant believes he is entering a dialogue and the other is preparing for formal argumentation, the asymmetry can affect both tone and substance. In this case, the shift placed Heschmeyer on the defensive, with his strongest arguments, curiously, appearing not in the live conversation, but in his follow-up video. The core content was not a challenge to church authority, but to its claim of being consistent with natural law. The crux of the debate centered on Catholic sexual ethics, particularly as they relate to same-sex attraction and behavior, grounded in the framework of natural law. Cade launched a frontal critique of natural law theory, challenging its coherence, applicability, and cultural embeddedness. He argued that the church's understanding of nature is not only culturally conditioned, but philosophically brittle. When subject to contemporary critique, he noted that natural law claims often rest on contested biological, psychological, or teleological premises, and that utilitarian exemptions undermine the universality natural law purports to uphold. Cade's rhetorical posture was sharp, but composed. He delivered his objections with clarity and without ad hominem attack or undue emotionalism, even when provoked by Heschmeyer's tasteless attempt at humor involving historical Greek culture and its attitude toward homosexuality, followed by a reference to topics too unmonetizable to mention directly on YouTube. Cade's ability to keep his composure under rhetorical pressure was noteworthy, especially given the personal stakes of the conversation for himself. That said, Cade's objections to natural law, while forceful in tone, did not always exhibit philosophical precision. His critique relied heavily on a modern empirical framework, questioning statistical and psychological claims that undergird certain ecclesial teachings, without always addressing the deeper metaphysical commitments of classical natural law. Note, I said of classical natural law, not classical theology, as this was profoundly not a theological debate. And what are these claims that undergird these teachings? Well, namely, the theological ordering of human faculties toward specific ends, i.e., procreation, union, life mating, if you will, and the common good. Cade's performance was rhetorically compelling, but occasionally lacked the formal distinctions a Thomistic or analytic ethicist might demand. On the other hand, Joe Heschmeyer's performance was measured but incomplete. Heschmeyer, for his part, was clearly caught off guard by the intensity and structure of Cade's objections. In the live exchange, he often responded extemporaneously, relying on intuition and broad principle rather than rigorous argumentation. That said, his follow up video, more carefully crafted, as well as supported by citations, showed that he understood the terrain more deeply than he initially presented in the live video. There, in the recorded response, he clarified his commitment to the Church's consistent witness on sexuality and natural law, provided references from the Catechism and various Catholic writers and philosophers, and made a clearer case for the philosophical basis of Catholic moral teaching. However, even in the follow up, Heschmeyer made several overgeneralizations, as he is prone to do, particularly when he attempted to construct moral absolutes in a vacuum, without acknowledging the theological tension posed by divine actions in Scripture. For example, invoking absolute condemnations of killing or other intrinsically disordered acts risk incoherence when placed against divine commands in the Old Testament: the conquest of Canaan, the death of Egypt's firstborn, the flood, etc. These episodes complicate any claim that X is always and everywhere wrong if God has commanded or allowed it in sacred history. This tension is not new, of course. Scholars from Augustine to Aquinas, and even to contemporary thinkers like Esther Hamori, whose book God's Monsters I recently reviewed on this channel, offer provocative interpretations of these difficult texts and have wrestled with the relationship between divine justice and moral absolutes. Heschmeyer's reluctance to acknowledge this theological complexity weakened parts of his moral critique. Moreover, Heschmeyer at times failed to distinguish between descriptive and prescriptive uses of natural law. For instance, saying that a behavior is unnatural in a Thomistic sense does not mean it is uncommon or statistically rare. It means that it is contrary to the theological end of a faculty. Cade exploited this blind spot, turning the critique into a cultural and psychological argument rather than engaging in the metaphysics of nature and purpose. As I said, this was not a theological argument. This was a philosophical standstill. From a purely analytical standpoint, the debate did not seem to move the needle significantly for either side. If Cade won, it was a win in performance and poise, not in philosophical rigor. If Heschmeyer lost, it was due more to rhetorical missteps and structural unpreparedness than a lack of counterarguments. The exchange did, however, highlight the need for better integration of Catholic natural law theory with contemporary debates on rights, identity, and human flourishing. Cade pressed on the friction between claims of intrinsic disorder and the lived experience of LGBTQ+ individuals, especially those who seek to live faithfully within the Church's moral framework. Heschmeyer rightly appealed to the universal call to chastity and self-mastery, but did so in a way that lacked pastoral nuance. What is missing from both sides was a clear articulation of how natural law interacts with empirical evidence. While Cade over-relied on contested studies, Heschmeyer underplayed the extent to which church teachings rely not just on metaphysics, but also on appeals to observable consequences, i.e., disease transmission, psychological well being, social cultural stability, etc. Both participants here would have benefited from a more interdisciplinary synthesis. A note on ecclesial and moral authority. Cade's broader project involves a sustained personal interrogation of Catholic moral doctrine through repeated engagements with Catholic voices, some of those voices being more robust than others. In this sense, his strategy seems to me to be exploratory rather than polemical, though that view can be contested. But from my point of view, Cade is testing the consistency and depth of various Catholic thinkers on different issues relating to queer and gay identity. This particular engagement with Heschmeyer is one in a long series of informal, off-the-cuff debates held by Cade, and that's not a criticism against Cade. Philosophical inquiry often requires the testing of boundaries, and Cade's courage in doing so publicly, despite pushback, is commendable. If not wise, still commendable. Still, Cade's arguments remain vulnerable to the charge of selective skepticism. His critique of natural law seems rooted in post-Enlightenment empiricism, yet he has not fully addressed the underlying theological anthropology that informs Catholic moral teaching. The Church does not teach that natural law is merely a matter of social utility or statistical analysis. Rather, it posits that the human person is ordered by nature and grace, aided by revelation toward certain ends, including communion with God and with others, through rightly ordered love. If Cade wishes to challenge that premise, he must engage not only with the data, but with the full sweep of Catholic metaphysics. Until then, his objections, while emotionally resonant and rhetorically sharp, will fall short of his goal of dismantling the foundations of Catholic sexual ethics. In sum, this engagement was more of a dialogue than a debate. It illuminated key fault lines in the current conversation about LGBTQ+ issues within the Catholic Church, but it did not significantly advance the intellectual case in either direction. Cade presented a polished critique of natural law from a contemporary rights-based perspective. Heschmeyer, though caught off guard, offered a competent theological rebuttal in his follow-up, albeit one that came after the fact and one that sometimes lacked philosophical humility and nuance. If we must score it, Cade won the debate on rhetorical grounds. But Heschmeyer's post-debate video was more philosophically substantive, if also more polemical. Neither side convincingly moved the dial. If anything, the real winner was the ongoing conversation, a conversation which, many agree, must continue only with more precision, more charity, and for us of the faith, with more attention to both scripture and tradition. As for me, I remain convinced of the value and utility of natural law, not as a static cultural artifact, but as a dynamic and reflective tool for engagement with the human condition as a created being. I affirm the Church's call to chastity and virtue for all persons, straight or queer. And I also believe the Church must continue to grow in its understanding of how to welcome, accompany, and address LGBTQ persons within the household of the faith. This was a 6 out of 10 debate, worth listening to and pondering, but its consequentialness has yet to be determined. Thank you for watching, and good night.